Shalom, I'm Rabbi Mark Raphael, Rabbi Emeritus of Kehilat Shalom. A short lesson for Tisha B'Av, using rabbinic sources to see the observance of the saddest day of the Jewish year, some of the theology, philosophy of that sad day, commemorating various catastrophes of Jewish history, and finally, a little bit of hope at the end from rabbinic sources. Starting with the history from Mishnah Ta'anit in the Gemara. I'll be reading the sources and then analyzing them a little bit. Source 1. On the ninth day of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that 1, they would all die in the wilderness and not enter the promised land. 2, the temple was destroyed the first time, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, and a second time by the Romans, and Beitar was captured, and the city of Jerusalem was plowed, as a sign by the Romans that it would never be rebuilt. Not as one fast on the ninth of Av, but from when the month of Av begins, one decreases in acts of rejoicing. So according to the rabbis, the black letter day of the Jewish calendar has its origins in the story of the spies in the book of Numbers. That here the people wanted to go back to Egypt after the plagues, after the revelation at Sinai, after all the miracles in the wilderness, and created a day on which bad things can therefore happen to the Jewish people. The first great tragedy, though, in historical reality, was the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC by the Babylonians, leading to the exile to Babylonia, creating the great diaspora of the Jewish people. The second great catastrophe is the destruction of the second temple, which was built in 516 BCE and was destroyed by the Romans in 70 and exterminated pretty much the population of Judea in the course of the Great Revolt that led to the destruction of the temple. In 133 to 135 roughly, we had the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Its centerpiece, its fortress was Beitar, was destroyed by the Romans in 135 CE. And the last date that's mentioned, or the last reality, is Jerusalem being plowed. That happened a year or two after the defeat of Bar Kokhba, and the Jews were then prohibited from going to Jerusalem anymore, and the area of the temple was plowed under and sowed with salt, so that it could never be used again for the temple. Later there were mosques, and then the churches built on that site, but there's been no temple since 70 CE. So a day of catastrophe for the Jewish people in ancient times, and through the medieval period, in some ways even in the modern period, often enemies of the Jewish people would schedule persecutions for that day. Some of the events of the Crusades happened on the 9th of Av. The expulsion from Spain, I believe, actually did happen on the 9th of Av, the decree in 1492. And down through history, whether it literally happened on Tisha B'Av is telescoped onto the day, becomes a day to commemorate Jewish suffering, to mourn for our losses, and to grapple with the meaning of our suffering. So how do we experience Tisha B'Av? From Ta'anit, a couple of chapter pages after the first source, the sages taught, the mitzvot practiced by a mourner are likewise practiced on the 9th of Av. It is prohibited to engage in eating and in drinking, in smearing oil on one's body, in wearing shoes, and in conjugal relations. It is prohibited also to read from the Torah, the prophets, the writings, or study from the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Midrash, from Halachot, and from selected collections of Agadot. So how do we commemorate the day? In some ways like mourning. Mourners are allowed to eat, but if you think about what mourners actually do eat, they're supposed to eat light. Drinking, obviously not allowed on Tisha B'Av, but mourners obviously should drink. Smearing of oil, in ancient times they didn't always take baths. Sometimes they would use oil to cleanse the body. Mourners in the Orthodox world, at least in many customs, do not wash. That's generally not the liberal Jewish custom. We still bathe and stuff like that when we're observing Shiva or preparing for a funeral. But many people, certainly when they return from the cemetery, will take off their shoes as a sign of mourning. The luxury of leather is a common tradition to be observed on the day, and sexual relations, conjugal relations, not being observed when you're in Shiva, but also not on Tisha B'Av. Fascinated by this idea of not studying things that bring joy. What can you therefore study on Tisha B'Av? Traditionally, the book of Job, the story of human suffering. Eicha itself, the book of Lamentations, that's read as part of the liturgy of the day. And selections from Jeremiah, especially predicting the destruction, are the most common biblical texts, along with some sections of the Mishnah and the Talmud, like what we just looked at in Ta'anit, where we grapple with events of Jewish history of suffering. So the rabbis grapple with why were the temples destroyed? Why does these kinds of events occur to us? From Bava Metzia. It was taught in a Braita that they must perform as referring to acting beyond the letter of the law, as Rabbi Yochanan said. Jerusalem was destroyed only for the fact that they adjudicated cases on the basis of Jewish Torah law in the city. The Talmud asks, rather, what else should they have done? Should they have rather adjudicated cases on the basis of arbitrary decisions? Rather, explain, they established their rulings on the basis of Torah law and did not go beyond the letter of the law. Fascinating idea. If you only judge strictly by the law, it leads to a kind of destruction. A literal only interpretation of what you're supposed to do and how you adjudicate leads to a loss of ethos in the process of justice. What else, therefore, do you need to go beyond the letter of the law? Understanding the intention of the law and applying that intention in the case that's in front of you. The rabbis in other places say, what are you supposed to do? Always the principle of what is good and right in the eye of God should have an impact upon how you decide a case. Famous Hasidic story of the Brisker Rav. A man comes to him and asks for wine for Passover, and then says, can't afford the wine, so just give me milk instead. At which point the Brisker Rav gives him not 1 ruble, which would have covered the cost of buying wine, but 5. So I said, why do you do that? And the Brisker Rav explained, he doesn't have money for wine, he still doesn't have enough money for meat for the holiday and for food for his family. So going beyond the letter of the law, which would have been to give him a ruble to cover the expense of the wine, his sensitivity, his kindness enables him to go further and to empower the man to have more. Also, rabbinic sources talk about the commandment in Leviticus to be holy. You shall be holy, which means the spirit of the law should always be informed by a sense of God's goodness, God's holiness, the quest for holiness in life. So going beyond the letter of the law means you combine compassion and mercy very often with what the strict sentence should be, and therefore to reach a better way of achieving justice in the particular case. When we get the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, we have the rabbis interpreting that since Bar Kamsa maims the animal, we'll read the story a little bit to summarize it in a couple of minutes, that they could not accept the sacrifice from the Roman emperor, and when the sacrifice is refused, because they are literalists about what can be sacrificed, instead of making the political considerations also, the Romans come and destroy the temple. That's not factually true, but it may be symbolically true. From Yoma, Masechet Yoma in the Talmud, page 9b. Why was the first temple destroyed? Text. Due to what reason was the first temple destroyed? It was destroyed due to the fact that there were 3 matters that existed according to our tradition in the first temple. 1, idol worship. 2, forbidden sexual relations. And 3, bloodshed. Certainly reading prophetic literature, we know how often the prophets condemn idolatry and the immoralities that went with it, the mistreatment of the poor, the violence, the lack of respect for people, because if you worship a piece of stone or rock or wood that you've made yourself, then what are you really worshiping? You're worshiping yourself, and there's no higher standard. Second, The rabbis believe firmly in the sanctity of marriage and relationship. When you break down those fundamental ethics of relationship, society unravels and family unravels. And finally, matters of bloodshed, that there is no justice in the society, that people are able to get away with murder, especially of the lower classes. The disenfranchisement of the lower classes leads to death and suffering, and the prophets condemn that as a fundamental cause of the evil. I don't put this in sociological terms, that if a society disenfranchises a lot of its members, when stresses come externally, like an enemy, or internally with social disruption, the society will not survive. That's the reality of cultures and great empires, certainly, that have collapsed over time, that only with an ethos of empowering opportunity, of having some quality of justice, that people feel they can be heard for their grievances and get some satisfaction, those are the things that hold a society together. So I always crudely put it, when the rich and the powerful say, let's go off to war, because it's going to make us more powerful, the poor and the helpless say, screw you, and the war is lost. Continuing in Yoma, why was the second temple destroyed? Given that during the second temple period, people engaged in Torah study, in observance of commandments and acts of kindness, why was the second temple destroyed? It was destroyed due to the fact that there was wanton hatred during the period. This comes to teach you that wanton hatred is equivalent to the transgressions of idol worship, illicit sexual relations, and bloodshed. So what's this wanton hatred? The rabbis tell a fable. It's not a factually true story as far as we know, but it captures a variety of different themes that were of concern to the rabbis and underlying historical kernel. The rabbis explain, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of a Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa. It was a man who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. Once this man made a large feast and said to his servant, bring my friend Kamsa. But the servant made a mistake and brought his enemy Bar Kamsa. The host said to Bar Kamsa, get out. Bar Kamsa said, I'll give you money for half the feast, just don't throw me out. The host said to him, no, get out. Kamsa said to him, I'll give you the money for the entire feast, please just let me stay. The host said to him, no, and finally, he had his assistants throw the man out. So after being thrown out, Bar Kamsa said to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest the action of the host, though they saw how he humiliated me, learn from it that they were content with what he did. I'll therefore go and condemn them to the emperor in Rome. And he went to Rome and said, the Jews are rebelling against you. The emperor said, how can you show this? And Bar Kamsa said, send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government, and we'll see whether they can sacrifice it. The emperor went, sent him a beautiful 3-year-old calf. While Kamsa was bringing the calf to the temple, he made a blemish, damaged the calf. So when Kamsa brought the animal to the temple, the priest would not sacrifice it because it was damaged, and they could also not explain this satisfactorily to the Gentile authorities, who did not consider it where it was blemished. The blemish notwithstanding, the sages thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative of maintaining peace with the government. Rabbi Zechariah said to them, if the priests do that, people will say that blemished animals must be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. And the rabbis said, if we don't sacrifice it, we must prevent Bar Kamsa from reporting it. Zechariah said, though, if you kill them, people will say, one who makes blemishes on the animal sacrifice is to be killed. As a result, they did nothing. Bar Kamsa's slander was accepted by the Romans, and consequently the temple was destroyed. Not a factual story, but it contains so many of the different themes that we're grappling with why is this suffering occurring. 1, sins of speech. Here we have people embarrassing others, cursing them out, mistreating them verbally and physically. This is the underlying wanton hatred. There's no reason for this kind of behavior. People venting and spewing with bigotry and hatred in their words, We see so much of that in our modern day. Is this the unraveling of our society? I hope not, that there over time will be a returning back to civility. Not in this story. The lack of civility is a root cause of the suffering that's about to occur. Second, causeless hatred. We don't know the underlying story of what was going on between Bar Kamsa and the host, but to hate someone so much that you can't show any respect for them, that you have to treat them as dirt and throw them out, and then in return the hatred of Bar Kamsa back to the community, difficult to understand. Getting angry, I understand. Hatred and pursuing a vendetta, crossing the line. Again, as stated earlier, the community going by the letter of the law, the animal is blemished. Yes, it should not be sacrificed. But in the context of knowing what is the spirit of the law, what are the consequences of observing the law in this case, maybe there's a need for some political savvy and sophistication, or have to face a far worse consequence. So pulling back though for a second, what's the historical kernel behind this story? The reality was that the various sectarians within Jerusalem during the revolt against Rome hated each other as much as they hated the Romans. There's a famous story that Josephus tells during the Jewish war against the Romans of one sect of zealots burning the main food supply of the city as the city is under siege. That leads to a lack of food in the city, a sooner defeat for the city, a more crushing defeat for the city. And if you can't work together even to maintain the food supply, how can you work together to at least hold off the Romans? They were not able to do that. So the causeless hatred between Jews during the rebellion itself was, according to Josephus at least, a fact, and leads to the inability perhaps to find a negotiated settlement down the line, or to a much more crushing defeat and extermination of the population of Jerusalem. Two other different answers. I'm not sure they're historically true, but they reflect the values of the rabbinate. From Shabbat 119b, Rabbi Hamnuna said Jerusalem was destroyed because school children were interrupted from studying Torah, as it is said in Jeremiah, I am filled with the wrath of God, I cannot contain it. Pour it onto the infants in the street and onto the gathering of youths together, for men and women alike will be captured, the elderly among those of advanced years. Now, what does that mean? Rabbi Hamnuna seems to be saying the reason for the destruction of the temple was kids were out wandering in the street, getting into trouble, instead of being in school and learning. Now, I don't know if that's factually true, but it reflects a core value of the rabbinic tradition, certainly of Rabbi Hamnuna, which is the core of a community is its ability to educate its children in its values, in its Torah, in its ethos. And if that does not happen, there is no future. The future is destroyed. And so Rabbi Hamnuna emphasizes instead not the causeless hatred of the previous source, but rather failure to educate children and leaving them without the wherewithal to be active, healthy citizens in a society. Different source, also from Shabbat 19b though, deals with the destruction of the temple. Ula said, the temple was destroyed because people had no shame before each other, as is stated from Jeremiah also. They acted shamelessly, they performed abominations, yet they are neither were ashamed, nor did they know humiliation. Therefore they will fall among the fallen, and I will punish them, says God. Chapter 6 of Jeremiah. So thinking in the rabbinic sources and biblical sources, what are abominations? In Proverbs we read, abominations are haughty eyes, lying, shedding innocent blood, scheming, mischief, inciting strife, and bearing false testimony. So ethical abominations, and if you're just doing the word abomination within the 5 books of Moses, what are things that are abominations? Idolatry, illicit sex, especially incestual, child sacrifice, which is probably not one of the things it could possibly have done during the time of the destructions, false weights, stealing, usurious interest, and acts of murder. So whether we deal with, I'll say, sins of speech, sins of intention, where they're dealing with actual sins of nature, of physical contact, of mistreatment, of stealing, of corruption, of acts of murder. Various forms of abomination are what Ula says led to the destruction of the temple. Which of these were true in the Second Temple period? Not sure, but I think the corruption of false weights, stealing, usury, and murder through lack of justice would have been things that probably were going on in the time period. And finally, a little more positive source from Bava Batra, chapter page 60b. Our rabbis taught, when the temple is destroyed, there multiplied in Israel those who separated themselves from eating meat and drinking wine. Rabbi Joshua said to them, "My children, why are you not eating meat and why are you not drinking wine?" They said, "How can we eat meat, which we would offer sacrifice on the altar, now desolate? How can we drink wine, was poured out on the altar, now also destroyed?" He said to them, "If so, we shouldn't eat bread, for grain offerings has ceased." And they responded, "We could eat produce." Rabbi Joshua said, "We should not eat produce, for the first fruits cannot be offered." They said, "We can eat other fruits." He said, "We should not drink water, for the water libations have ceased." And then they were silent. He said to them, "My children, come here, and I will say to you, it is not possible to mourn at all, for the decree has already been decreed. But it is also impossible to mourn too much. We do not decree a law on the community that the community cannot live with. Rather, the sages teach a parable. A person plasters his house with plaster, but he leaves a little bit unfinished. A person makes all the needs of his meal, but leaves a little bit out. One makes all of her jewelry, but she leaves a little bit off. As it says, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand be forgotten. If I don't remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not set Jerusalem at the head of my celebration." And he concludes, "And all who mourn for Jerusalem will merit seeing its celebration, as it says, rejoice with her, Jerusalem, be glad for her. All you who love her, rejoice with her in joy. All you who mourn over her." So a lot of people ask, do we still need to observe Tisha B'Av? We have Israel, we have Jerusalem back as a unified city. Maybe we should drop Tisha B'Av. And yet, Jerusalem is not a city of peace yet. There's so much turmoil and stress for the city. Israel does not live in peace with its neighbors. To have treaties, at least, we still have a long way to go with the Arab world and the rest of the world with its growing anti-Semitism. So every year when we observe Tisha B'Av is an opportunity to remember the past suffering of our people, that we are not whole. We do not have Jerusalem as a city that is complete and at peace. And also, it's okay to mourn, not just when we lose a loved one, but for the suffering of our people down through the ages. It's one of the things that make us unique. We tell the story both of our achievements, but also of our suffering. And that gives us an opportunity to understand who we are, where we've been, and where we hopefully are going to go. That we are participants in healing the world. This world can be a hateful place, filled with incredible suffering. Some of it natural, some of it interpersonal and human. And here on Tisha B'Av, we pause and remember all of the bad things that have happened to us as a people, trying to learn from those realities, not that we were at fault, not that we should be blamed, not that we are not victims, we are victims, but at the same time, we are here to heal the world, not to become angry and vengeful in the face of everything that's happened, that we experience God's love in the most powerful and beautiful way, that God cries with us on Tisha B'Av and some of the Midrashim that I didn't bring here, and that we're allowed to cry on Tisha B'Av and find our healing in that process of being part of a community that grieves together, that mourns together, and that heals together to be able to go forward, especially in this time of COVID-19, to find our way back to health, to joy, and to peace. Thanks for studying with me. Hopefully you got the study sheet also. Easy fast if you're fasting. Peace and health.